Welcome, everyone, to the Berlin Science Week, first of all. It's a pleasure to be here and to be a part of this event. We're here, hopefully you're in the right place, at Should We Publish in Academic Journals? And I'm going to give you a few opening remarks. First of all, a very warm welcome. Thanks for making your way out here. And it's really great to be here with such a diverse audience. I've seen many researchers, we have also publishers, members of the general public here with us today, all who have somehow an interest in this topic. My name is Jess Rohmann, and I'm an epidemiologist at the BIH Quest Center at the Charité, also at the Institute of Public Health there. And 6 years ago, I co-founded the project Perspectives, which is a researcher-led training program for early career researchers in the biomedical sciences, teaching them about scientific peer review, which is also why I'm particularly interested in today's topic. It's my great pleasure to be your moderator for today's debate. And this event is organized by the Berlin University Alliance together with the Einstein Foundation Award. The award is valued at 35,000 euros and given annually, celebrating efforts to improve the quality of knowledge generation, sharing, and evaluation across all disciplines. And the Berlin University Alliance is a partnership of the Freie Universität Berlin, Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, Technische Universität Berlin, and the Charité Universitätsmedizin Berlin. It's also a test of my German. And the BUA works together across disciplines to establish Berlin as a leading hub for high-quality open research. Together, these organizations came together to host today's debate and reflect on this very important question in the scientific community. To set the stage, since we are a bit of a heterogeneous group tonight, I want to give a very quick introduction to the topic to get us all on the same page before we hear from our speakers. So the idea of publishing scientific finals in journals as we know it today dates back arguably to 1665, when the Journal des Savants in France and the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in England were launched. For the first time, research findings were formally recorded, shared, and judged by peers. Journals began in this way to provide credibility, careful curation, and a permanent record of discovery, serving as the backbone of scientific communication. They allowed researchers to build on each other's work with confidence, creating a structured and verifiable trail of knowledge. Over time, the system evolved and became more and more formalized. As we know it today, researchers conduct studies, write manuscripts reporting their methods, results, discussion, interpretation, and submit these papers to scholarly journals for consideration by editors. There, the manuscripts undergo peer review. This is where other experts in the field evaluate the work for quality, for validity, and for originality. And then if the articles are accepted at the journal, they're edited, formatted, and published, increasingly today online, making them accessible also to a global audience. This system has shaped science communication over the last 350, or more than that, years, providing a framework for evaluating and disseminating knowledge that's enabled the growth of modern science. But over time, the system has become overwhelmed. I think that's clear to many of us here in the room today, and it's gotten very complicated, to put it lightly. The volume of publications keeps growing exponentially, putting peer review, this system that's so essential to scientific publishing, under extreme strain. There simply aren't enough reviewers to maintain the quality control promise that journals once reliably provided. The process to publish can also be very, very slow, taking months or even years, delaying access to important findings and frustrating authors. New challenges like AI-generated manuscripts, images, paper mills add further complexity and raise questions about credibility. At the same time, many articles remain behind paywalls, limiting access to publicly funded research, while career incentives prioritize quantity and novelty over rigor and reproducibility. Taken together, these tensions show why many stakeholders feel the system is no longer scaling, and it doesn't match with how science is actually done today. So just 2 days ago, maybe some of you heard, the Stockholm Declaration on the Reformation of Science Publishing was released, calling this the largest science crisis of all time and urging clear reforms. Wow, so we're here in a timely moment. This sets the stage for the question at the heart of today's debate: should we keep publishing in academic journals? And in today's debate, you'll hear from two speakers who have different perspectives on what should be changed. Okay, so we have Bernd Pulverer and Alex Freeman. I'll introduce them shortly. They're sitting here in front. But before we dive in, I just want to make a few clarifications on the overall theme and some scope and boundaries we thought about. First of all, this debate is not particularly about book publishing. You might have noticed we're talking about journals, articles in journals. Don't mean to exclude the humanities by any means, just that these fields have their own dynamics, and we're not going to be able to cover that today. We're focusing on publishing in journals where the scale and speed of publishing maybe make the problems most visible, not to say that they don't exist elsewhere, and even though much of what we discuss probably transcends discipline and boundaries. We're also going to leave out, for now, the discussion about commercial versus non-profit publishing. We can move into this a bit in the Q&A if folks are interested, but otherwise I think that would take over the entire debate. So we're actually going to focus a bit more narrowly to start, but feel free to save those questions of Elsevier versus EMBO, put those at the end. And these boundaries are just because of the limited time we have, and we want to focus on the core system itself. So reflecting on whether the structure of scholarly communication should be modernized and repaired or rebuilt entirely. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who brings the viewpoint of a nonprofit academic publisher affiliated with a leading organization supporting the biosciences. Bernd Pulverer is head of scientific publishing at EMBO Press, the publishing arm of the European Molecular Biology Organization, EMBO, which is Europe's leading learned society in molecular biology. EMBO Press has been publishing leading peer-reviewed journals since 1982. And Bernd is a molecular biologist with an extensive editorial background. He's held senior roles at Nature, Nature Cell Biology, and the EMBO Journal. And in addition to his editorial work, he oversees publishing at EMBO Press, just on the side, right? So Bernd, the next 20 minutes are yours to argue why elements of the classical journal-based system should be maintained in some form. We really look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jess, for the great introduction. I believe I've been randomly chosen to go first, but of course, I've been set up. That's very clear. Let's see if the votes change. So I'm representing the blue side, so of trying to, and I will argue for maintaining the publishing landscape in some form or another, but I will not be arguing to maintain the status quo as we've known it from the last century, as you heard. So that's an important differentiator, and the question was quite clearly formulated in some form. So please keep that in mind. I'm trying to convince you that we can add to the existing process, some of which includes key elements that have evolved over a couple of centuries, as you heard, and are really at the heart of the academic success we've seen. And I will, of course, represent mostly the biosciences, but what I'm saying, I think, pertains to at least all the natural sciences, but even beyond that, I think. So there are some general things that we have learned over the last couple of centuries from the system. And it would be a pity if we threw out everything as a baby with the bathwater in a revolutionary step when we can evolve it, I think, quite effectively. So I will not try to shy away from some of the bottlenecks that we found, some of the shortcomings that we clearly have in publishing. I will basically try to articulate how we can solve these problems. The quality in scientific publishing has become a problem, but I think it's a victim of pressures of research assessment that have caused these problems. And publishing is just one of these victims. It's not the cause of many of the problems that we see. So I think the cause should be changed, and that's at the level of research assessment. And hopefully that's something we can all agree on at the end of today. Academic publishing, as you heard, co-evolved with scientific research in the Age of Enlightenment as a systematic, rigorous discipline in the 18th century. The framing of research into well-defined projects and as a collaborative pursuit rather than individualistic pursuit, which was sort of epitomized by Newton saying, if I've seen further, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants, is really framed around the structure of the research paper that evolved around the same time. The research paper has an introduction, so you summarize existing knowledge. It has a results section where you present your new findings, and then it has a discussion section where you analyze and interpret your findings and open it up for others to reinterpret. And that discipline has really shaped how we do science and all academic pursuits. So basically, what did we know, what did we find, and what does it all mean? And that's really a structure, I think, that rigor is coming in through the research paper. And nowadays, of course, we bookmark our activities by applying for grants. When you conceptualize your research, you have to apply for funding. And we on the journal side are on the other side of that project, and we never really connected your grant application with the way you write your paper. Together, these look like an overbearing amount of extra work. It looks like we're adding friction for no particular purpose. But I think together, these two disciplines provide rigor and structure to the effort. So the second reason why research papers and also reviews are really important is because they synthesize an ever more complex information landscape that we have to understand as humans, for now, at least. The human brain can really only absorb narratively structured information. And that's why we try to describe our very complex and often messy findings. I'm talking from biology, where data is often extremely messy. And we are shaping it into pictures, into images, into schemata that we can remember very easily. That's a core function of the research paper. I think that continues to be important in the future. Now, AI has fundamentally changed that and is changing it very fast, of course. But I would pose that research will remain a human pursuit for some time. And it's at least important that humans can interpret and build on incredibly complex and often extremely messy information landscape that we generate in biology. The third important point, and probably the most important, is and the reason we publish in journals at the higher level is that they're gatekeepers. So the academic journal, and this is since already the mid-20th century, evolved mechanisms, as you already heard, of evaluating and quality controlling the science that is published. And this process is called peer review. It is a really interesting process that appears to be pseudo-altruistic, where your colleagues come and help you essentially improve your own work and often don't take any credit for that. Why does it work? It's because we all help each other. So the referees get reviewed themselves and the work improves overall as a community. The journals are primarily, the peer review process at journals primarily is set out to improve the work that journals publish. Now, many of you may raise their eyebrows and say, well, journals just reject papers. It is also true that journals filter information. So we try to improve it. If we cannot improve it, we reject the papers. But this provides a very important enrichment and filtering function so that the human reader, who can only absorb a finite amount of information, we're publishing about 3.5 million papers per year in the biosciences alone, can rely on journals to pre-filter the information that they really have to read. There's, of course, a lot of frustration around peer review because it can, in principle, be weaponized. Your work can be held back by your direct competitors. They can use it to inform their own work. And other journals that claim to do peer review but don't really seriously do peer review can use that to legitimize charging a lot of money for journals that really don't add any value to the process at all. So there are problems with peer review, but good journals know how to deal with these problems and have buffering mechanisms improve the quality of the process. For example, at EMBO Press journals, the referees referee each other's reports, and the authors have an equal stake in the game by discussing the referee reports with the editors before we make editorial decisions. We have also added various other policies and mechanisms that are spreading also to other journals to add transparency and accountability by publishing all the referee reports and by ensuring that the referees know that their work is itself a formal part of the research output. What is missing in peer review is any form of formal credit for referees. And I think that's one of the important flaws in the system that we have now. So peer review alone is not enough at scientific journals, and quality scientific journals go beyond peer review to do quality control processes that are often intrinsic to the journal. This can include research integrity screening or for example, checks on the quality of the statistics and so on. This is extremely involved and is extremely expensive and actually accounts for some of the costs that may appear to be excessive sometimes. So the fourth reason why journals are important is because they're aggregators and filters of information. So beyond screening for the basic quality that I've been talking about of research, so are the claims made in the paper supported by data? Is the data itself reproducible in some form? Journals also filter for the general interest of the science. At least general journals do, or highly selective journals do. Now, why is that important? That's important, again, because we're swimming in an information swamp. And it's extremely important to realize that this information is growing exponentially. And it's becoming ever more complex, which is leading actually to hyperspecialization of, at least in the biosciences, a very rapid hyperspecialization where any individual researcher is really only aware of research in their very narrow domain of specialization. It's extremely important that journals fulfill their traditional function of trying to cross-fertilize knowledge across subject domains and silos. This used to be called browsing. It's something that was extremely powerful in the cellulose world of publishing. You heard already we're mostly online these days, but it's extremely important to think of ways that we can retain this cross-fertilization. It's often also called coffee room science, where in great research institutions like the ones you see on the slide here, there's great social spaces where people actually stumble across findings almost serendipitously and by chance and start forming collaboration. And those are the Nobel Prize winning discoveries of the future, not just digging in with keyword-based searches into your own domain and finding information. So journals have that traditional role, but can we maintain it? And also, how relevant is it in the age of AI? AI is, of course, and particularly next generation AI, is extremely powerful in finding not only information, but also formulating interesting hypotheses, testable hypotheses based from very complex information domains across all outputs of research, not just high impact factor journals, for example. So that's going to be a very interesting discussion, and I hope you have some questions on that to see where the browsing function of traditional journals is going. So let's consider some of the bottlenecks before I close. As I noted, research assessment and credit systems are the key problem. They have evolved to rely almost completely on publishing as a proxy for measuring performance. So initially, research assessment started to rely on the volume of published output, and that still exists in many countries around the world. So that's one problem, that scientists are often more or less incentivized to salami slice their findings and to publish their results at all costs, because all that matters is to get that number of papers out. That's also a problem that has been led to the profiteering of a whole fraction of the publishing world that is basically just designed to churn out papers as fast and in as high volumes as possible, which is spurred on by open access based on article processing fees. So these predatory journals have to be removed from the system, and it's very important that we discuss how we can do that effectively. Now, the volume-based research assessment was then replaced some years later in the mid of the 20th century by bibliometric-based research assessment, and particularly the journal impact factor became very important here. So this is something that has become very dominant at the, if you want that, so the perceived higher end of research, and it's something that's also been gamed by many journals and everyone in the system, in fact. So the most important search criterion that we find when people look for journals where to publish in is the journal impact factor, unfortunately. So everybody's trying to optimize their performance and capitalizing on that. We've called that out already 15 years ago with the San Francisco Declaration for Research Assessment, and it's taking a generation to change things. I do want to make the point that whatever other system we evolve, Goodhart's law states that it will be gamed just as much as the current journal world. So whatever we evolve, if research assessment doesn't change, the same problems will arise. So this is not per se a reason not to publish in journals. Then I should also mention author credit. There's many ways that the actual individual credit that scientists get from publishing in papers is not sufficiently granular because only first authors and senior authors count. This is something we have also been able to address very easily by having authorship at the individual experiment level, at the figure panel level in research papers. I briefly mentioned the importance of giving academic credit to referees. That is something we're working on very actively now, and that can also be solved. A couple of more points, and then I'm going to stop. Open access has been already mentioned as a very important problem and an important driver of also misbehavior. The system is now moved to about 50% open access. It's a no-brainer that open access in principle is the right way to go. However, we must develop mechanisms that open access does not become as inequitable as subscription-based access by preventing authors from accessing journals as to publish their papers. Pace economy is very difficult. That's only based around authors paying for the publication of their papers. So we have to work on that. The money is in the system. So in principle, we can shift it, but it requires all the stakeholders to shift together. So what about the future open science? And then I'm going to stop. It's very important to realize that we can build open science into the journal as we have at the moment. It's very important that we start to add real data behind the figures we publish in papers and methods and protocols that underlie the experiments we did. The narrative description is necessary but not sufficient to advance science. This can be done, and we've mandated this now for almost a decade at EMBO Press, and many other journals are doing similar things, that we have real data in papers. So that's not a reason not to do away with journals. We can add open science on top of journals. And this is also not to say, and to close now, I want to say that we should stop to share every science in research journals and research papers alone. We can share science as reproducible units, and if you want open science preprints or data-based preprints, and then only assemble them into this narrative format for a subset of papers that are fully peer-reviewed and quality controlled, and that will depressurize these bottlenecks of not sufficient referees in the system. And then I also believe we still have to retain reviews and sort of meta-analyses of science on top of this, which is typically provided by journals, because otherwise the human brain can simply not navigate the information swamp. I'm going to close there.
All right, thank you very much, Bernd, and perfectly in time. So that is also great for our Q&A round later. Now we're going to move right away into our next speaker's presentation, who will argue for why the current journal-based system should be replaced entirely. Alex Freeman founded Octopus in 2021, a new publishing platform for scholarly research where researchers can publish all of their work for free and in full detail. The platform is funded by the UKRI, the UK government's research funding agency. Alex has also served as a crossbench peer in the House of Lords since 2024 and is widely recognized for her work in science communication and evidence-based policy. She was previously executive director of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication at the University of Cambridge and spent 16 years at the BBC producing acclaimed science programs. Alex, the next 20 minutes are yours.
Thank you very much. When we were given this assignment, I felt I had the easier task convincing you that we should get rid of journals, because I kind of feel that everybody who works in research wants to change the system. I mean, I haven't met anybody who says, yeah, let's carry on. This is fine. No problems to see here. But we've got to make a slightly different argument. So my argument tonight is that we should get rid of everything completely. Which I think is a slightly different argument. And I'm going to start it by thinking, what is a journal? And Bernd made this lovely argument that, you know, we sit down and we read a journal and we look at the articles around our article and we think, oh, that's interesting. Yes, that's something I wouldn't have read otherwise. No, we don't do that. They're online. Articles are branded. That's what a journal is. It's a brand, and it's a brand that sometimes we buy. Because we pay our article processing charge to get our brand. But we're not going to go into the finances here. But I'm going to talk about why I think that very format of an article is not how we should be sharing our research. And it starts with thinking about, why do we publish in the first place? And I think there are three reasons. One is so that other people can understand what we've done and learn from what we've done and build on what we've done. A second reason is so that others, and probably those same people, can assess the trustworthiness of what we've done. They want to know how robust our findings are and how much weight they should put on them. And the third thing, slightly more selfishly, is so that we ourselves can be assessed, so that other people can see how good we are at doing our jobs as researchers. And that's important because, you know, in the world of careers in science and in research, people need to be assessed for what they do. So I'm going to think about how good an article format is at doing those three things. And I think, first of all, the first problem is the depth and the detail of articles. So have you ever read an article that is completely replicable from what you've seen? That you could just sit down with just that article, not speak to the authors, and absolutely understand all their thought processes, everything they've done, and replicate it? Yeah, it's pretty rare. I've done replication studies, and I've always had to get hold of the authors and ask them for more details. So that, I think, is a first failing, if you can't tell exactly what's been done. Secondly, have you ever done work that didn't get published? I mean, surely we all do work that didn't get published. All of those thoughts, those ideas, those pilot studies, extra data, none of that's getting published. So I think that is also undermining the whole process, because especially dead ends and things that didn't work don't get shared, and therefore that means that we don't learn from them. And if science and research is trial and error, and directed trial and error, you need the error in order to learn where not to go. And the other problem, I think, with the detail and the depth of articles is, how do we share things that aren't words effectively? I mean, huge printed data sets are not great, even in PDF formats. Love them, we do. Images, they're okay, but they're not great if you've got, 3D scans, or if you've got vast databases of images, if you've got genomic databases, if you've got any of these really in-depth sources of data, then an article format is really, the old-fashioned article format is really not the way to share it. So I think these essentially magazine articles are really not the format that we should be sharing our research in. But I think it's actually worse than that as well. Because this narrative format that's been so well defended by my opposing speaker here, I think is actually undermining the whole process. Because to create a narrative, and I know because I've created a few in my time as a BBC producer, you want a nice, neat, clear story. You want to prune away all of the side issues, certainly all the things that didn't work. Who cares about those? You want a nice story. And I know that when I submit papers to journals, they want a nice, clear narrative story. They want, we thought this, we did this, we found this, and that means this. And that's not how research actually works. All of the really important stuff gets left out, but worse than that, we start being pushed towards the questionable research practices. We have our results, and then we think, oh, it would be neater if we'd thought we were going to get those results in the first place, so we hypothesize after the results are known. That's the first kind of naughty step of the questionable research practices. Then maybe we take out some outliers in the data that are making it look not very neat and tidy, and then maybe we do a bit of p-hacking to get ourselves some significance. And then it's a terribly slippery slope. I won't go any further down it. It's dangerous, and we need to avoid this because not only does it undermine the science, but it makes all of the... If we are using these articles as a way for research to be assessed, then we are leading people down the pathway of trying to show off to be assessed well, rather than to be honest and to be trustworthy in what they're showing. So that leads me on to assessment. Peer review. Yes, it's important. And when I was more naive, it used to be the mark of trustworthiness for me. I used to think, oh, this is in a peer-reviewed journal. This is in a high-impact journal. I'll believe this article. I mean, maybe the world has got more complex, and maybe I've just become more aware of the complexities of the world. But approval is not a black and white thing. A peer review shouldn't be, yes, it's fine, or no, it's not. Or even behind the scenes, we've improved this article, so now it's fine. Peer review is something that we should all be reading. We should all be learning from. This is one expert's thoughts on this. This is another expert's thoughts on this. These experts have different levels of expertise in different areas that the article covers. So I think peer review, yes, it's important to understand the views of others, but the way that we do peer review is not helping us. It's a non-transparent, behind-the-scenes, gatekeeping type role. And I think if that really changed, then of course it could be useful. And I think peer review also requires the detail that the article doesn't contain. So how can you rely on a peer review from a peer reviewer who hasn't seen all of the bits that aren't in the article? So if they haven't got access to the data, if they haven't seen the analysis code, how can they do that peer review? But it also needs to be quite specific. How are we expecting peer reviewers to review all aspects of that paper? If you've got 2-3 peer reviewers at a really rigorous journal, then have we really got somebody who can dig into the analysis and really understand what's been done there? Have you really got somebody who's enough in the field to know enough about the way that this method's been designed? Have we got somebody who is thinking really broadly about the question that's been asked and its relevance and its impact? It's unlikely. So I think that peer review really, it requires different specialists, it requires openness, it requires transparency. And talking of specialists and professionalism, I think this is where the credits are a problem. Because who did what in an article? And why is an article now... I mean, I know why it is. So basically, we are researchers who specialize. When I write an article, I collaborate with other people because I'm not an expert in... Well, I can't do quantitative analysis. So I get postdocs who know what they're doing on quantitative analysis. I work on methods. Other people collect the data. I might interpret it, but we're all playing different roles in this research process. It's not clear in an article, even when you have those little credit statements, who exactly did what in that. And it's not easy to be a specialist in things that get you a middle credit, as Bernd said, in the author list. So we're not incentivizing people to become specialists, to professionalize in things like methods, in data collection, in analysis. And because we're not allowing each of those to be a publication in its own right, to be a specialism in its own right, that I think is undermining the peer review as well. So if we allowed each of these smaller pieces of work to be a publication in its own right, if you could publish a method and not have to have collected data on it, then a method professional, a specialist, can publish methods, and a method specialist can peer review that method. And then that method can be published in a way that everybody transparently knows is trustworthy enough to put in the resources to go and collect data according to that method. And then different data sets can be collected by different people, enhancing that replicability. They can be peer reviewed by people who understand the data collection and can write a good review about how well this data is being collected according to the method, how reusable it is, and the same for analysis and interpretation. And this opens up a whole new way of collaboration, because I think the way that an article forces you to collaborate with the people you know, perhaps with the people that you are geographically close to in the same lab. Even if you collaborate across the world, you're collaborating only with the people who are around at the same time as you. You can't collaborate with people in the future if you're not giving the people in the future all of the information they need to collaborate with you. So what I mean by that is that I could publish data now, and if I published it in full in a way that allows somebody else 20 years down the line who's developed an amazing analytical technique to collaborate with me, then we're getting the best of everybody through the whole world and through time. And that is good for research in general. It's good for the findings to be more robust, but it's good for us as individuals as well, because it starts to break down some of that institutional bias that grows up, that you want to be in an institution that allows you to collaborate with the people in that institution. Instead, we could have a much more free and exciting world where you can collaborate with anybody wherever you are in the world. And this leads me on to my concern about the role of journals as gatekeepers and as pruners of what gets published. Because who gets to do what and who gets to publish what is in the hands of a few people, these editors in journals. And of course, they're wielding that power, and some of them may be wielding it very benevolently. But everybody has biases, and we know about the volume of work that's coming into them. There are biases in what topics are getting chosen to be published, and that changes what gets researched, and that is to the detriment of, say, rare diseases. And it's also a detriment to those who don't easily get published. Those people who don't have access to the mainly English-speaking journal system, those whose institutional affiliation makes journal editors have implicit bias. And so this narrowing of power into a few journal editors, relatively few, allows the potential for corruption, which we do see in some journals. And it also means that when you've got a hierarchy with power concentrated in some people, that allows a really toxic research culture to build up. There's the potential for bullying. There's the potential for that kind of corruption within the research community, because people at the top have so much power around the careers of the people lower down. So my summary then is that I think the format of articles and the branding that we call journals is really rotten to the core. I don't think there is one part of the system as it is now that's designed to support best research practice. If you really think about it, not one of those aspects that we've discussed tonight is doing the best it can to support all the best practices that we in this room know it should be. And that, to me, means that we need an entirely different system for the communication of our research, and one that's designed around thinking, how do we incentivize what we want to see? How do we reward best practice? And I don't think that's an article format in a branded form in a journal with hidden peer review and journal editors as the gatekeepers.
Thank you. Well, handily, I have actually designed the system, which I think would work, Octopus. So yes, that argument was based on my thinking behind the system that I launched in 2021, in which you publish in smaller units and they're linked to each other. So you can't publish results without them being linked to a method. So you form these branching chains of publications. And peer reviews can be linked to any kind of publication, and they're treated like any other. So I think we agree on the peer review should be recognized as a scientific skill, just like any other, a research skill, just like any other. The problem that you talk about the flood of publications is an interesting one, because we're seeing now with preprint servers the problems that they are having to raise the gates because they're being flooded not just by sheer volume of written papers, but by AI-based papers. And this is the new world that we live in. And it's, I think it is a problem. And I think the only way, so Octopus is completely open, there's no barriers. You have an ORCID to log in. So if you have an ORCID, you can then publish. You have to link your publication to an existing publication to form in a chain. So that kind of slows it down a bit. But you could easily write a script that created ORCIDs and then found links and made links. The only way I think that the research world can survive this influx of publications is through what I call many eyes, which is community working on it. Because at the moment, all of that flood goes through these narrow gatekeepers of whether it's a preprint service or whether it's a journal editor. And that's just not possible to have this enormous volume going in through this small nozzle. So I think we have to, as a community, deal with the problem. And that might mean that some people are building automated tools to do some automated screening. Great. Some people are then going in and looking at things and flagging them, like we have the sleuths who do that work. And they can then flag them, and either authors can respond and explain and reversion if they've made an honest mistake, or that's now flagged and the community realise that's flagged. But I think it's a joint responsibility, and I don't think we can. I think it's almost an argument for more open work, because then all of us can play that role of moderating it. A bit like Wikipedia works, which hasn't yet broken, which is a kind of miracle and a demonstration that community can work.
I'd like to give Bernd a chance to respond to that point, because Bernd, in your part, you alluded to the fact that there are, at least the established journals or some journals, have found a way to deal with this flood. They've learned from their experiences and they're able to manage. So I'd just like to give you a chance to respond to that or any other point.
Right. Well, let's talk about the flood. I think there's several different levels of flood. I mean, you mentioned briefly the AI-generated flood. There's a flood that's generated by folks wanting to game research assessment and so on. So, assuming research assessment does not dramatically change with time, those floods are very real and problematic. But there's also the flood that you didn't get back to, which you mentioned, which is the flood of unleashing all data that you generate in the lab on the whole community, which is orders of magnitude more information being exchanged. And I would pose that it's impossible to peer review, at least human peer review, all of this information effectively. So of course, automation is advancing very, very rapidly. And it's very clear that in a few years we can use AI-based quality control mechanisms to at least sort of have a baseline quality control on basically in an infinitely scalable manner. So that's great. I would not defer this to sleuths, which is sort of a new job title apparently, which is people that have too much time on their hands to look at other people's works with a sort of often a negative starting point of trying to find misbehavior, which dramatically exists. We have about 10% of the papers we look at systematically at EMBO Press have problems. So I'm not denying these problems are dramatic. However, the problem there is that it's an uncontrolled mechanism. So essentially, it relies on goodwill and objective behavior, and that can happen. There's platforms out there, for example, Papier, which is a fantastic platform launched by 2 French scientists, which we use a lot actually at EMBO Press, and that found a lot of issues also in papers that we have published, which we missed. Extremely effective, but many issues that are raised there are not real issues, and sit there and can taint the reputation, of course, of the scientists affected. And it's not effective in the sense of resolving these issues systematically. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, of course. It's just very, very few. For us, we get about 200 posted per year, actually, which makes it very difficult. Just yesterday, I went through 70 of them. So we're trying to stay on top of it, but it's extremely hard. That's I don't want to delve in too deeply into the integrity issue here, but the basic problem I have is how do you quality control if you unleash all the data you generate in the lab in a way that's still useful for the community and doesn't mislead them? Maybe you can respond.
Just briefly, as we pass the mic, if you are new to this topic and you haven't heard about these sleuths or you haven't heard about PubPeer, actually Elizabeth Bick and the founders of PubPeer won some of the Einstein Foundation awards last year, which are focused on improving quality in science. And there are really great YouTube recordings where they're talking about these in detail. So you can have a look if you're interested.
Yeah, and what they're doing is spending their time looking for mistakes or fabrications and then publishing them openly so that the journals are then more transparently forced to respond to them. I think you were posing to me the question of how to deal with this huge amount of data. Well, I do think that, as I said, that having it open there allows people to develop tools to deal with it. So I think, the more that we open up problems to the world, the more likely we are to find solutions. If we keep the problems to ourselves or to a small group of people, then you're relying on that small group of people to find a solution. And if you're keeping it to a small group of commercial entities, then you're making it even smaller. And I think the world is full of people who have, perhaps, as you say, too much time on their hands. But I think that time on their hands is very generously given to the communities quite often in order to develop tools that make it easier for the rest of us to find things, to solve things. They're people who are creatively solving problems. And if the problem is that we've got a lot of data that's in a machine-readable form that needs interpreting, I think there will be people who then work on that problem and develop tools to do that.
Really quick response, and then we'll get the next question.
Okay, so I also have to be really clear that I completely agree with you that there is this extreme cognitive bias by only sharing positive findings and so on. So we absolutely have to embrace the complexity of the research findings we generate in a more holistic way. However, one of the big challenges is that everything I comment from the biosciences, but I think it applies across the board. We typically train people, an order of magnitude more people than we have senior roles for. So people are competing invariably in a sort of pyramidical scheme for a very limited number of roles. So we are selecting typically at the 10th percentile at everything we do in the biosciences. The grants, the jobs, the research papers, everything is around 10th percentile. Now, I'm not sure this is super healthy, but it's the reality also. And And that's why this whole system evolved, I think, because these are actually quite similar, the selection mechanisms in the end. I'm absolutely not advocating that journals should be the decision makers on job hirings and on research grants. This is, I mean, I'm a co-founder of the San Francisco Declaration. You know, that's what it's all about. But that's why it evolved. And I have not heard a solution yet that will help us deal with that problem, that we have to select in the 10th percentile range. Maybe you can answer.
I know we want to go to another question from the audience, so I'll keep it quick, but that is the world. You know, every profession, it's highly selective, and you have to be able to judge people on how well they are doing that job. When I was in filmmaking, it was relatively easy because my job was to entertain people and inform people, and we had feedback from the audiences on whether I was doing that, and that was how I got selected for jobs. And in research, we have to think about research assessment and what each researcher is trying to do and how good they are at it. And that's why I think that we have to break down the units of publication so that we can break down the units of assessment to be able to assess people on specifically what they're setting out to do, so that people can specialize and that it can be really transparent what they do. Because if you're an author on a paper that's got 10 or more authors on it, that's not helping anybody know exactly what you've done. So that's why I think we have to break it down. So this is one of the drawbacks of the format of tonight. So I don't think that we should get rid of all journals, because I think that what journals do is bring findings that might be useful to practitioners in a narrative form, so that, you know, if I'm a working doctor or working engineer, I want to be able to read, you know, I'm not going to dig into a massively geeky article in full detail in publications. I want a summary of, here's the important findings, is this what we think is important. So I think that synthesis role and that dissemination role should be done in an article form, in a narrative form. But I think that article or narrative can be for any audience. So maybe it's in Nature, maybe it's in New York Times. You know, they're different audiences and you'd write in a different way. But I don't think that that's useful for primary research and research assessment. So I think that there are different levels, and Octopus and the formats I'm talking about are the way that researchers communicate with other researchers in the same field, and also where the research assessment goes on. And then on top of that, you have different layers of communication and dissemination for different audiences, and that's where the filtering and the narrative comes in.
I'm going to let Bernd respond, and then we've got a question in the back there.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think we both want to have our cake and eat it, and I think we are actually very, very close, in the sense that we agree that reviews are useful, that sort of meta information is useful, news and views, and maybe news articles on science is useful and has to be curated and so on for different audiences. Where we sort of differ is to keep at the heart of it the research paper. And you know, I'm arguing that we can build on the research paper and add the granularity that you're talking about, but build around the research paper, because these are scalable mechanisms that we can apply to research papers. So, for example, in our case, we are we're activating postdoc level referees now to look into the source data that we're publishing with our figures. So they are data experts that can really have the time to delve into the data itself. But they're incentivized to do that because it's in the paper and there's an output that is published, that's prestigious, and they feel incentivized to do it. I struggle a little bit to see this scalable across all scientific outputs, basically, at the moment, unless we change the incentive system completely. And of course, we also agree we need to do that, but I just think it's not totally realistic to make this completely scalable. But I think we're quite close in the sense that we want to fragment it and make science more granular and more data oriented, essentially. Where we differ is that I still see that at the heart of it, the research paper, and build on that, and you think we should start from the bottom up. Well, there were several aspects there. So the me, and so on. It's absolutely true that publishing is very much or by some is seen as an advertorial, just to sort of navigate the prestige space and place the next research grant or place the next job. That's a corrupting force that is difficult but understandable. So has it changed so much? I'm not sure. I think this is actually quite an old tradition to some extent. Now you're saying you started off saying reproducibility is not that important. I think it's actually very, very important, because we are basing the experiments we do on information exactly as you say, built on others. So we're standing on the shoulders of giants, but we have to know that these are giants, that this is not flawed information. You invest 3 years of a postdoc's career, which is the whole career essentially, on a flawed project, and that person is out essentially. So we have to be able to rely on the information sufficiently that we invest the time and resources and taxpayer money to build on it. So I completely agree that science is all built on previous work, but that's why reproducibility is so important. But for those who are not from the biosciences, there's many different orthogonal studies that point to only about 50% of the biosciences being at least easily reproducible in the basic sciences. That is a really low number, and it's extremely disturbing. And that's just published papers in peer-reviewed journals. So that's a really big problem, and I think we have to really improve the reproducibility of what we share. And I would say we have to start in the journals. If we can scale this to Octopus is a whole different question, and that's where I hand over to you.
Well, I think there's two things I'd pick up on there. One is that it's interesting you say you don't have time to do reproducible, to try and replicate other people's work. And that implies that for you, and I'm sure this is true of most people, what you find exciting is new stuff that isn't replicating someone else's stuff. And actually, I think we need to change that and make it so that we are proud and excited about the integrity of our work, whatever that work is and whatever the findings are. So what we should be aiming for is not always to be trying to go out into the dark and into the unknown, but instead concentrating on, is what I'm doing as robust as it can and solid as it can be, and that the robustness and the quality of our work, the intrinsic quality of our work, is the stuff that really makes you feel, I've done a good job, and that is then rewarded by the people who employ you. And the way I think about this in terms of Octopus is that at the moment I feel that we are incentivized to try and build as tall a tower as we can. Our articles are like buildings where we put flags on the top, and whoever makes the tallest ones, they stand out in these high impact journals, and we get rewarded for that. And people aren't really looking at the quality of the brickwork and the foundations, and the height is what matters. And I think in Octopus, what I want to try and do with the way it's all structured and incentivized is that instead we're concentrating on each brick that we put down, and what we get rewarded for is the solidity and the positioning of each brick. And the towers will then come as an emergent property from the community. These towers will emerge, and we'll know that those towers are built on solid foundations, and that we as a community will be able to trust them. And I think changing both the self-satisfaction that we get and the reward that we get from others, to instead of being, a tall tower and we've got a finding in the unknown, to I've done work that is really, really good. I think that's what we need to change, and I think that's the whole incentive thing.
Okay, well, allow it.
Just very briefly, because we talked about two different types of reproducing. I was talking about reproducibility, you're talking about reproducing science, and both are really, really important. I think the reproducing science is a point. If any funders are in the room, they have to answer that, because we are very happy to publish reproducing science. We're also very happy to publish refuting science, by the way, that disagrees with previously published science. We're making a specific point of that. However, it's not incentivized at all in the system to invest financial and human resources into that. So unless the research assessment system changes there, I don't think we can do the brick in the wall type of thing. Okay. No, that's a really great point, and we're thinking a lot about where responsibility for certain aspects actually lie. We would say for things like research integrity screening and so on, it should not be the journals. It really has to be the institutions that pre-filter information before it goes out. Absolutely, we're not trying to hog all the responsibility for the screening process. We're just seeing stuff, and as soon as you see stuff, you think, oh, I have to look more systematically, and you see more stuff, and you can't stop basically looking. But it's absolutely not scalable that this is concentrated, as you say, in the nozzle of just a few gatekeepers. So yes, we have to re-engineer the system with automation, but also with cross controls between labs, maybe in research institutions, on to have more checkpoints in the system, because it's not fit for purpose at the moment. Very, very important, I think. And I think just one point I wanted to make about the nozzle aspect, though, is which just occurred to me again. We would argue it's actually extremely useful to have a nozzle that is independent of a research institution for certain types of filtering. And we're seeing this a lot with research integrity assessments, which is classically deflected back to institutional investigations. There's always a bias. So if you happen to be the director of the institute and you're under investigation, it's extremely, almost impossible to have a neutral investigation, right? So there is a case to be made for having independent journals, not necessarily at for-profit entities, however, independent of the research activity or research enterprise itself. So our editors are all full-time professional editors that are outside of, so they don't have a conflict in that sense. They may be more ignorant, but they're less conflicted.
Alex, go ahead.
Yes, I think maybe I have a low opinion of institutions, and I'm sorry if there are institution representatives in the room, but I don't feel that, I think the incentive structure that institutions are under means that they don't do any filtering, and they're not really incentivized to do any filtering, because they are looking for, their funding comes from their researchers getting funding from funders, and that means that it's all the same incentive structure. So they are caught up in the same incentive structure, and whenever I speak to institutions about trying to change the publishing system, they may, and obviously there are good people within institutions who recognize the problems and want to change it, but they feel impotent because they themselves don't have the financial resources to do anything. So for me, the people that need to change the system or be the first movers in the change of the system are the funders. But I find that institutions are frustratingly slow at stepping up to the mark when we're talking about things like hiring and promotions and following some of these declarations that we keep having annoyingly. Everybody recognises the problem and we have a declaration, and then we don't take the next step to actually do something about it. And I do know that there are some institutions that do, so I'm not tarring all with the same brush. So I think you've almost answered your own question, because you brought up the rewards and recognition system. And the reason that you think you don't have time to do things is because you've got to prioritize the things that get you rewards in the system at the moment. So at the moment, it's all focused on doing the work that's going to get you a paper. And that might involve quite a lot of wasted time about formatting things for papers, writing introductions that really don't need to be written because it's the same as your last paper, and doing slightly pointless revisions for, we all know reviewer 2 and the editor. So I think there is wasted time in the system, but I think more importantly, it's a matter of what we prioritize, because actually doing work rigorously and doing work to make sure that our work can then be built on. So putting the work in and the resources in to add metadata, to make sure your data is reusable, to make sure your code is clean and understandable, to do all of these open science things, that is incredibly valuable. I mean, if you talk to funders who really care about the data that they are essentially paying for, that's work they want to pay you to do. What we need to do is to make sure that the incentives that you are all under recognize what's actually important to the research community. And if reusability of data, understandability of code, trustworthiness and robustness of findings is important, and it is, we need to make sure that that's reflected in all of the things that we're incentivized to do. So that is, as you say, about institutions and funders in their grant application processes, ensuring that all of this is recognized and that you're then rewarded for it. And I think it's difficult sometimes when you're inside an incentive structure to imagine it being that different. But try and step back and think, what if I were incentivized to spend the time, if when I get to the next stage of my career, what they're looking for is how good is your data and code and how reusable is it? Imagine that was the main thing you were being judged on. It would make a difference to how you felt about whether you have the time to do that.
Yeah. So maybe just to follow up. So first of all, I'm impressed that there was a vote from Leiden in blue initially anyway, because it's certainly true that Leiden and other Dutch universities are really leading in open science. So that's really, really impressive. And I think it shows that countries can change the flavor of how science is done actually in a constructive way. So we're not really disagreeing. I think the one thing I would quickly disagree as a side note is that revisions are always useless, and in narrative papers it's a bit of a kind of throwaway. And the psychological reason for this very typical throwaway remark about referee 3 and revisions being useless is, of course, that we have this rosy-colored view of our beautiful prose and the way we write papers. I mean, if you look to before and after, and I've done this for 30 years, it's dramatic how papers improve at good journals.
It's the same with films. If you make a film and you don't have an editor, it's terrible.
And it needs to be a different person to direct. Yeah. Okay, so we actually agree on that too. That's annoying. Okay. So the point is about the assessment. How can we change research assessment to make the reproducibility and the sort of basic data more, the quality of the data better? So we talked about automation. I think that's a really important thing that will happen, and that is, of course, for code, for example, really, really powerful already, but it's going to develop super, super fast. So I'm more excited. So there's already extremely powerful AI-based peer review systems that are emerging at a level which was unimaginable just a couple of years ago. I'm much more excited about quality control mechanisms at the AI level that are going to be here in 2 years, and I think will solve a lot of this. And I'm also excited to again, a point I made very briefly is to activate post-op level of quality control there. And I see this really as, you mentioned that the funders are really should be challenged on all of this. I think that is the research institutions, again, that should be challenged. It should be part of the training that you become a good data referee, essentially, in papers. That should be core part of the training of a postdoc, and it should be valorized when you get your next job. If you've been a person, and that's already happening, for example, in IT, where if you're a person that improved code for other people, that is visible on GitHub, and that gets you a job, basically. So that has to start to happen, I think, in the way we hire people for more senior roles into PI positions, for example.
Yeah, it is a good question, and I have spoken to physicists who say, yes, we don't need Octopus, we're sorted, thanks. I'm not sure I totally believe them, but I recognise that, and when I ask them about why it works better for them, the scholarly publishing system, I get answers like from an astrophysicist. They said, we all have to work from the same data, it comes from a telescope. So that data has to be clean and it's available to the whole community, and you're then judged on how you interpret that and your analysis of that. And I think that is a that's a big difference. It's a difference in culture, possibly more than anything, because they recognize that the data has to be robust, and that they recognize that there's a danger of contamination of that data, and therefore they all work together to make it as clean as possible. And there's a more collaborative aspect to the way that they work. I don't know quite how they've achieved that culture, and whether it is to do with the topic and the way that they work, or whether it's a community thing that when you get a culture and you can nurture it, that you can defend that culture and it just doesn't break down in the way that we see in some other domains. I don't know. But yes, I'm sure there's lots that we can learn from them. And also the comment on GitHub, for instance, that's another domain and a field where people say, we should learn from GitHub, and they liken Octopus to GitHub. And I think there are some aspects of GitHub. For instance, you're saying people get hired based on how well they have commented on other people's code and improved other people's code. Well, that requires a record, that requires an open way of working, and it requires open peer review, as it were, and a more granular way of working, so you can see exactly who's done what. So that is what I think Octopus has in common with that, and why that is a useful feature to copy across, as it were.
Yeah. So just to echo the point, it's such a good comment to make that we should learn from across disciplines. To add to the point of why is physics much more collaborative, astrophysics, particle in particular, because they have individual machines they all rely on, and they have to be collaborative, yes. I think it's also a scale question. Biology is probably an order of magnitude larger, and the community doesn't know each other anymore. It's one aspect. If everybody knows each other, they all met in CERN before, and sort of are, in a sense, in the same really close-knit community, to this highly distributed way we do medical science, for example. That's one aspect. So the social aspect, I would say. And then one other aspect is biology is extremely messy data. It's extremely underpowered. There's a lot of intuition, a lot of gut feeling. We're typically working below statistical significance and still decorate religiously our data with error bars like Christmas decorations. But it works because we have intuition, and we know what sort of is robust and what's not. Often,
what about that 50% of not working?
At least half the time we know that. So I think those three dimensions make biology very, very different. And how can we recreate these things? There's maybe the best example is the Human Genome Project, which started out and intuitively immediately morphed into an open science project before the word open science even existed. Because it was so apparent that sharing 24/7 and just doing this collaborative was the only way to actually get it done, that complexity of research. So when there's a need, people fall into line. But I don't know how this works in cell biology or medical science. I have no solution.
So just keeping an eye on the time here, I think we've actually come to the end of our public Q&A. I just wanted to take these last few minutes to thank both of our speakers. I think this was very insightful. I'm not sure how, I saw a lot of people nodding along, so let's give them another round of applause. To end, we talked a lot about the future and visions for the future, and I really appreciated how concrete the speakers were in some of their suggestions. And I see a lot of early career researchers in the audience, and we are now navigating this phase of transition to get there. And that's tough. And I hope that for me, this session was actually quite therapeutic in some way, to hear how tough some of this stuff is. And I just wanted to mention that the organizations hosting this event, the Einstein Foundation Award and the BUA, also do provide platforms and have resources for those of us at all stages and in all of these roles that have been mentioned here today, peer reviewers, editors, and so on, to network and talk about things across disciplines. And I think we can learn so much from each other. Like we heard from the physics field, for example, we can take maybe things that work well in a platform like Octopus and see how can we make that work in Berlin, at the Berlin University's publishing, for example. So there should be more of this exchange. If you find yourself in a role where you'd like to make that happen, we're launching, for example, an editor network called BNet at the end of the month. You can come talk to me or Nele, who was bringing around the microphone after the event. There are just many resources and ways to connect in Berlin specifically, and we'd love to talk to you more about it. So this should just be the start of a dialogue. I know our speakers are willing to stick around a bit. There are pretzels and some refreshments. So just a big thanks for being here, for your interest in this topic, and we look forward to what's to come in the future. Take care.
Thank you.